The air in the Redemption Town Bank was thick with the smell of stale paper and unfulfilled dreams. Dust motes danced in the shafts of late afternoon sunlight, cutting through the grimy windows, illuminating the weary face of Jonathan Hawley. He stood at the teller's cage, his posture stooped not by age, but by a weight that settled deeper than his bones. He was trying to start over to bury the man. He had been a Texas Ranger with ghosts in his eyes, and become someone else, a simple landowner, content with the silence of the vast, unforgiving plains. The small pouch of coins he pushed across the counter was the last of his savings, a meager foundation for a new life. Suddenly, the lazy afternoon peace shattered. The saloon doors across the street burst open, and 4 riders thundered down the dusty thoroughfare, their horses kicking up clouds of ochre grit. Shouts erupted, followed by the sharp crack of a pistol shot that sent a flock of pigeons scattering into the bleached blue sky. Panic seized the street. Men and women dove for cover, their faces pale with a familiar practiced terror. Before Jonathan could react, the bank doors flew inward with a violent crash. 3 men, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas, stormed the room. 2 fanned out their 6 guns, leveled with chilling efficiency, while the third, a mountain of a man with a shotgun, bellowed on the floor. "Now hands where I can see 'em." Jonathan, along with the 2 other patrons and the trembling bank teller, complied instantly. The cold, rough-hewn floorboards pressed against his cheek, the scent of sawdust and fear filling his nostrils. His ranger instinct screamed at him to act, to draw the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip, but those days were over. He had come to Redemption to escape the violence, not to invite it back into his life. He kept his head down, his hands flat on the floor, praying for it to be over quickly. The leader of the outlaws, a wiry man, with eyes as cold and gray as river stones, vaulted over the counter. He moved with a predator's grace, his movements economical and devoid of any wasted motion. He ignored the teller's panicked whimpering and began stuffing stacks of bills into a canvas sack. His name was Cutter, and his reputation for swift, brutal violence preceded him across 3 territories. But this was more than just a robbery. As Cutter finished emptying the drawers, he paused. His gaze swept the room, lingering on the prone figures, and then, with an unnerving sense of purpose, it settled on Jonathan. He stepped back over the counter, his boots thudding softly on the wooden floor. He walked directly to where Jonathan lay, the metallic jingle of his spurs the only sound in the tense silence. "Well, look what we have here." Cutter's voice was a low, gravelly rasp. He nudged Jonathan's shoulder with the toe of his boot. "Get up." Slowly, a cold dread coiled in Jonathan's gut. This wasn't random. He was being singled out. He pushed himself to his knees, his eyes fixed on the outlaw. "I don't want any trouble," he said, his voice quiet but steady. Cutter let out a short, humorless laugh. "Too late for that." He holstered his pistol and, with a flick of his wrist, revealed a silver locket dangling from a chain around Jonathan's neck, previously hidden beneath his shirt. "Pretty thing. Where'd you get it?" Jonathan's blood ran ice cold. The locket was all he had left of her, of Sarah. "It was my wife's," he said, his voice tight with a sudden fierce protectiveness. Was Cutter repeated, savoring the word. He reached out, but Jonathan instinctively flinched away. Cutter's eyes narrowed into slits of pure malice. "Don't you move." With a swift, brutal motion, Cutter's hand shot out. Not for the locket, but for the butt of his holstered pistol. He brought it around in a vicious arc, the heavy steel crashing against the side of Jonathan's head. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain and then dissolved into a dizzying, sickening blur. Jonathan crumpled to the floor, the world spinning around him. Through the ringing in his ears, he felt Cutter's rough fingers tear the chain from his neck. He heard the man's satisfied grunt as he pocketed the locket. A little message from Mr. Blackwood. Cutter muttered more to himself than to Jonathan. Then to his men he barked, "We're done here." The outlaws backed out of the bank, their guns still trained on the terrified occupants. They mounted their horses and galloped out of town, leaving a trail of dust and shattered peace in their wake. Jonathan lay on the floor, the side of his head, throbbing with a searing agony. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow, gaping wound that had just been carved into his soul. They hadn't just stolen money. They had stolen his last connection to the life he had lost, the memory he held more sacred than anything else in the world. Inside that locket was a miniature portrait of Sarah, her smile a beacon in the darkness of his past. Now it was gone. He pushed himself up, his vision swimming. The bank teller and the other patrons were staring at him, their pity mixed with a fresh dose of fear. The name Cutter had mentioned Blackwood echoed in his mind, a name he recognized as the ruthless land baron, who was slowly strangling the life out of the valley. But why? Why him? As the townsfolk began to emerge from their hiding places, their murmurs filling the air, Jonathan knew one thing with absolute certainty. His hope for a quiet life had just died on the floor of the Redemption Bank. They had taken more than a silver locket. They had taken his peace. And in its place, they had resurrected the one thing he had tried so desperately to bury, the cold, relentless resolve of a man with nothing left to lose. The town sheriff, Elias Thorne, arrived minutes later, his face a roadmap of weary resignation. He was an older man, his shoulders permanently slumped under the weight of a star that had long since lost its shine. He helped Jonathan to a chair, his touch gentle but his eyes filled with a familiar defeat. "Are you all right, Holly?" Elias asked, his voice gravelly. Jonathan touched the tender swelling wound on his temple. Blood slicked his fingertips. "They took it, Elias. They took Sarah's locket." Elias sighed, a deep rattling sound that seemed to come from the very bottom of his soul. He had already heard the story from the other witnesses. "I know, son. Cutter's gang. They're fast and they ride for a man who is untouchable." Blackwood Jonathan said the name, tasting like ash in his mouth. "Cutter said it was a message from him." "What does Silas Blackwood want with me?" The sheriff's eyes darted around the room, as if the walls themselves had ears. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Blackwood owns this valley, Jonathan. He owns the water rights, the freight company, and half the businesses on this street. He believes he owns the people too. He doesn't like newcomers buying up land he considers his. This was a warning, a cruel one, but a warning nonetheless. He's telling you to leave." Jonathan's hands clenched into fists. "He thinks he can drive me off my land by stealing a memory. He thinks he can drive you off by showing you that he can take anything he wants, anytime he wants," Elias corrected grimly. "And he's right. I don't have the men or the resources to go after Cutter. They'd be halfway to the territories by now, and Blackwood's lawyers would have me tied up in knots before I could even form a posse. My advice, sell your plot to him. Take what he offers and get out of this valley with your life." The advice was practical, sensible, and to Jonathan it was utterly impossible. Leaving would mean letting them win. It would mean dishonoring Sarah's memory, letting the last piece of her be swallowed by the greed of a man like Blackwood. He shook his head, and the movement sending a fresh spike of pain through his skull. "No, I'm not running." Later that evening, the throbbing in his head had subsided to a dull, persistent ache, but the emptiness in his chest had only grown. He found himself in the town's only saloon, the Gilded Cage, a place that was ironically owned by Blackwood himself. The air was thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, sweat, and sawdust. A lone piano player tapped out a mournful tune in the corner, a soundtrack for the defeated men hunched over their drinks. Jonathan took a seat at the bar, ordering a whiskey he had no intention of enjoying. He was a man adrift, his carefully constructed new life demolished in a matter of minutes. He stared into the amber liquid, seeing not his own reflection, but the ghost of a smile he was terrified he might forget. "Looks like you had a rougher day than most," a voice said beside him. He turned to see one of the saloon workers, a woman named Elena, polishing a glass with a clean rag. She had dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than most, and a quiet strength in her posture. She moved with a purpose that stood in stark contrast to the aimless despair that filled the room. You could say that Jonathan replied, his voice gruff. "I heard what happened at the bank," she said, her voice low. "About your locket. I'm sorry." Her sympathy felt genuine, a rare currency in a town run on fear. He simply nodded, unsure of what to say. Elena leaned against the bar, her expression serious. "Sheriff Elias is a good man, but he's caught in Blackwood's web just like everyone else. He tells you to run because he doesn't want to see another good man buried on that hill. I'm not running." Jonathan repeated the words, tasting more like a vow than a statement. "But I don't know what to do. Cutter's gang is long gone." "Gangs like Cutter's are just dogs on a leash," Elena said, her eyes meeting his in the bar mirror. "If you want to get your property back, you don't go after the dog. You find the man holding the leash." She paused, placing the clean glass on the shelf. Silas Blackwood is a man who likes routine. He meets with his business partners every week at the freight office, but he always sends his right-hand man to pay off hired guns like Cutter, a man named Jedediah Stone. Stone is arrogant. He drinks too much and he likes to brag. If you want to find Cutter, Stone is where you start. Jonathan looked at her, surprised by the directness and danger of her advice. "Why are you telling me this? It's risky for you to even be seen talking to me about Blackwood." A flicker of something old pain perhaps crossed her face. "Let's just say I don't like bullies. And Blackwood is the biggest bully in this valley. Someone has to stand up to him. Just be careful, Jonathan. Blackwood's web is tangled, and a lot of flies have gotten stuck in it." He left the saloon with a newfound sense of purpose. Elena's words had given him a direction, a thread to pull in the suffocating tapestry of Blackwood's control. The fight was no longer just about a stolen locket. It was about a town held hostage, about a man who believed himself to be above law and consequence. As he stepped out into the cool night air, the stars glittering like chips of ice in the vast dark sky, Jonathan Hawley made a decision. He would unravel Blackwood's web one thread at a time, or die trying. The ranger he thought he had buried was not dead after all. He had just been sleeping. Over the next few days, Jonathan began his quiet investigation, moving through the town of Redemption like a ghost. He was a man of few words, his gruff, clipped manner a shield against the prying eyes and fearful whispers of the townsfolk. He learned to listen, to watch from the shadows of alleyways and the corners of the general store. He saw how Blackwood's influence was a poison that had seeped into every aspect of life. Men lowered their gazes when one of Blackwood's riders passed, and business owners paid their protection fees with trembling hands. Following Elena's advice, he focused on Jedediah Stone. Stone was a brute of a man, with a face like a slab of sun-cured leather and a perpetual sneer etched onto his lips. He was Blackwood's enforcer, the iron fist inside Blackwood's velvet glove. Jonathan watched him stride through town, collecting debts and issuing threats with casual cruelty. He spent his evenings at the Gilded Cage, drinking heavily and boasting of his importance to anyone who would listen. Jonathan bided his time, waiting for the right moment. It came on a moonless night when Stone, deep in his cups, stumbled out of the saloon and into the dark alley behind it. Jonathan was waiting for him. He stepped out of the shadows, blocking the man's path. "We need to talk, Stone," Jonathan said, his voice low and even. Stone squinted, trying to focus his blurred vision. "Holly, the ranger. Heard you were looking for trouble. Don't need trouble." "I'm not looking for trouble," Jonathan replied, stepping closer. "I'm looking for Cutter. And you're going to tell me where to find him." Stone laughed, a wet, gurgling sound. "You've got nerve, I'll give you that. Blackwood told me you'd be a problem." He straightened up his hand, dropping to the pistol at his hip. "But problems have a way of getting solved in this town." He drew, but he was drunk and slow. Jonathan, honed by years of life-or-death reflexes, was faster. He didn't draw his own weapon. Instead, he lunged forward, his hand clamping down on Stone's wrist, twisting it brutally. The gun clattered to the ground. Jonathan slammed Stone against the rough brick wall, and the impact knocking the air from the bigger man's lungs. "I'm only going to ask you once more." Jonathan growled, his face inches from Stone's. "Where is Cutter?" Stone, his drunken bravado evaporating in the face of cold professional violence, began to stammer. I don't know. He works for Mr. Blackwood, that's all I know." Jonathan pressed his forearm against Stone's throat, cutting off his air. "That's not good enough. You paid him. Where did he go to collect?" Panic flashed in Stone's eyes. He gagged his face, turning a blotchy red. The old mission," he choked out. "San Jacinto ruins. North of here. They were laying low there." Jonathan eased the pressure, a grim satisfaction settling in his gut. "Thank you." He drove his fist into Stone's jaw, and the enforcer crumpled to the ground in an unconscious heap. Jonathan retrieved Stone's pistol and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving the man to his drunken dreams. The ruins of the San Jacinto mission were a 2-day ride north, a skeleton of sun-bleached adobe crumbling back into the desert from which it was built. It was a place of ghosts and echoes, the perfect hideout for men who wanted to disappear. Jonathan approached with caution, leaving his horse tied in a rocky canyon a mile away and making the final approach on foot. He crested a ridge and looked down. 3 men were camped in the mission's dilapidated courtyard, their horses grazing nearby. He recognized Cutter immediately, his wiry frame unmistakable even from a distance. A cold, hard knot formed in Jonathan's stomach. He checked his Colt, the familiar weight, a grim comfort in his hand. He waited for nightfall, for the desert to cool and the shadows to lengthen. When the outlaws had settled around their campfire and their guard lowered by a shared bottle of whiskey, he made his move. He moved like a phantom, his steps silent on the sandy earth, using the crumbling walls for cover. He came upon the first sentry from behind, a swift, silent takedown that left the man unconscious before he could make a sound. The other 2, Cutter and his lieutenant, were laughing by the fire, oblivious. Jonathan stepped into the firelight, his pistol leveled. "Evening, Cutter," he said, his voice calm and deadly. The laughter died in Cutter's throat. His hand darted for his gun, but he froze when he saw the cold certainty in Jonathan's eyes. "Holly, you're a harder man to kill than Blackwood figured." "Blackwood made a mistake," Jonathan said. "He sent a thief to do a man's job. I want what you took from me." "The locket." Cutter sneered, a glint of defiance in his eyes. "You came all this way for that cheap piece of tin. Give it to me," Jonathan said, cocking the hammer of his Colt. The sound was sharp and final in the quiet night. For a long moment, no one moved. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the adobe walls. Then, with a sigh of resignation, Cutter slowly reached into his vest pocket and tossed the silver locket onto the ground between them. "There. Take it. It ain't worth dying over." Jonathan kept his gun trained on Cutter as he bent down to retrieve it. The cool, familiar metal felt like a part of his own soul being returned to him. He could have ended it there. He could have shot Cutter and his man where they sat, an act of vengeance the law would have likely overlooked. But the ghosts of the men he had killed in his ranger days were company enough. "Get on your horses and ride," Jonathan said, his voice flat. "If I ever see you in this territory again, I'll kill you." Cutter and his man scrambled to their feet, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and surprise. They mounted up and spurred their horses into the darkness, vanishing into the night. Alone in the ruined courtyard, Jonathan finally allowed himself to breathe. He opened the locket. The tiny hand-painted portrait of Sarah was still there, her smile as warm and gentle as he remembered. A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees washed over him. He had her back. But as he held the locket, his thumb tracing the familiar engraved patterns on the back, he felt something odd. A slight looseness, a seam he had never noticed before. prying at it with his fingernail. He was stunned when a false back popped open. He had owned this locket for over a decade and never known of its existence. Tucked inside the tiny hidden compartment was a small, tightly folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. With trembling fingers, he unfolded it. It was a fragment of a land deed, the ink faded, but still legible. It described a parcel of land in the Redemption Valley asterisk, his asterisk parcel of land. And at the bottom, there was a signature asterisk, Elias Holly asterisk. His father's signature. A sudden chilling memory surfaced. A night from his childhood, long buried under years of pain. His father arguing with a slick, well-dressed man from the city, a land speculator who wanted to buy their ranch for a pittance. His father had refused, clutching a deed in his hand. "This land has been in my family for generations," he had declared. "It's not for sale." A few weeks later, raiders had attacked. They had come in the dead of night, their faces hidden, their motives seemingly random. They burned the house to the ground, and in the chaos, his parents were killed. Jonathan, just a boy, had barely escaped with his life. Everyone had called it a tragic, senseless attack by bandits. He returned to Redemption with a storm raging in his mind. He found Elena at the saloon, closing up for the night. He showed her the deed fragment, his hand shaking. This was inside the locket. My father's signature. Elena's eyes widened as she looked at the paper. Elias Holly. I've heard that name. She hurried behind the bar and retrieved a small locked wooden box. From it she pulled a stack of old newspapers, their pages brittle and brown. "I collect stories," she explained, her fingers flying through the papers. "Things people want to forget." She found what she was looking for, a yellowed article from the asterisk Territorial Dispatch asterisk, dated 15 years prior. The headline read, asterisk, Homestead Tragedy, Holly Family Slain, in Bandit Raid asterisk. The article described the attack to fire, the deaths of his parents. And at the end, a small, almost insignificant paragraph mentioned that the disputed land claim had been settled shortly after, awarded to an ambitious speculator from the East by the name of Silas Kane. Silas Kane. Jonathan read the name aloud, a sense of dizzying unreality washing over him. He changed it when he got more powerful. Elena said softly, her eyes filled with a sad understanding. He wanted a name that sounded more established, more respectable. Silas Kane became Silas Blackwood. The world tilted on its axis. Every piece fell into place with a sickening click. The raid on his family's ranch wasn't random. Blackwood, or Kane as he was then, had orchestrated it to get his hands on the land, to get the deed he couldn't buy. The bank robbery wasn't a simple warning to a newcomer. Blackwood knew exactly who Jonathan was. He had sent Cutter not just to intimidate him, but to retrieve the locket, terrified that the other half of the original deed might still be hidden within it. Jonathan had returned to the one place on earth that held the key to his past. He had settled on the very land his family had died to protect, and he was facing the same man who had taken everything from him. This was never about a piece of silver. It was about a legacy of blood and fire. The fight for the locket was over, but the war for his family's memory, for justice, had just begun. The revelation settled over Jonathan like a funeral shroud. The air in Redemption suddenly felt colder, the shadows in the alleys deeper. Every friendly nod from a townsman seemed like a potential betrayal, every closed door a hidden threat. He was not just a newcomer fighting a land baron. He was a ghost returned to haunt his family's murderer. He knew he couldn't face Blackwood directly. Not yet. He had no proof beyond a faded newspaper clipping and a fragment of a deed. It was his word against that of the most powerful man in the valley. He needed more. He needed the other half of that deed, the piece Blackwood had likely held for 15 years, the document that would legally prove his family's ownership of the land, and by extension, Blackwood's motive for their murder. His focus shifted. He was no longer just a man seeking justice. He was a hunter, and Blackwood was his prey. He began to watch the man's movements, studying his habits, with the patience of a wolf stalking a stag. With Elena's help, he pieced together the routines of Blackwood's life. The weekly meetings at the freight office, the nightly dinners at the town's finest restaurant, the armed escorts that never left his side. One afternoon, as Jonathan watched from across the street, he saw Blackwood himself emerge from his office. Silas Blackwood was not the brutish thug Jonathan had imagined. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored Eastern suit, his silver hair neatly combed his posture, exuding an aura of untouchable authority. He moved with the refined grace of a gentleman, but his eyes, when they swept across the street, were as cold and predatory as a snake's. As if sensing he was being watched, Blackwood's gaze met Jonathan's for a fleeting second. There was no flicker of recognition, only a dismissive glance, the kind a man gives to an insect. But Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. Blackwood knew. The pressure began to mount. One of Blackwood's men tried to pick a fight with Jonathan in the street, a clumsy attempt at intimidation that ended with the man nursing a broken nose. The next day, the blacksmith refused to shoe Jonathan's horse, muttering apologies about being too busy. The general store owner suddenly found he was out of stock of everything Jonathan needed. Blackwood was isolating him, turning the entire town against him with invisible threads of fear and economic control. Sheriff Elias sought him out, his face etched with more worry than usual. "Jonathan, you need to stop," he pleaded, his voice low and urgent. "You're stirring up a hornet's nest. Blackwood's been asking questions about you. People are scared. He's squeezing this town, and he's using you as the excuse. He killed my family." Elias, Jonathan said, his voice hard as flint. "He murdered my mother and father for the land I'm standing on. Are you going to tell me to let that go too?" The sheriff paled, his eyes widening in shock and disbelief. "What are you talking about?" "The Holly Ranch. That was bandits." It was Blackwood. Jonathan stated the conviction in his voice, unshakable. He explained about the locket, the deed, the name change. Elias sank onto a nearby bench, the color draining from his face. He ran a trembling hand over his mouth. "My God," he whispered. I was a deputy then. I remember the investigation. It was closed so fast. The territorial judge was a friend of Kane's, of Blackwood's. We were told not to ask too many questions. The shame of his own complicity, however unwitting, hung heavy in the air between them. "Even if it's true, what can you do? It's his word against a dead man's." "You have no proof." "Then I'll find it," Jonathan vowed. A few days later, a formal invitation was delivered to him. It was a summons written in elegant flowing script on expensive parchment. Asterisk, Mr. Silas Blackwood requests the pleasure of your company for a private dinner at his residence. It was a trap. Jonathan knew it. Elena begged him not to go. "He'll have you killed and buried where no one will ever find you." She warned, her eyes dark with fear. "He won't kill me at his own home," Jonathan countered. "That's not his style. It would be too messy, too obvious. He wants something. He wants to see what I know to measure me." And more importantly, Jonathan knew that Blackwood's ranch was the most likely place to find the other half of the deed. This was a risk he had to take. Blackwood's ranch was a fortress, a sprawling mansion of dark timber and stone, built in a valley that should have belonged to the Holly family. It was a monument to stolen wealth. As Jonathan rode up the long manicured driveway, he saw armed guards posted at every corner. He was shown into a lavish dining room, the table set with fine china and silver. Blackwood was waiting for him, standing by a roaring fireplace, a glass of brandy in his hand. He smiled, a thin, bloodless motion of his lips. "Mr. Holly," he said, his voice as smooth as polished wood. "Thank you for accepting my invitation. It's not often I get to welcome a man of your particular talents to my humble home." The politeness was a thin veil for the menace that radiated from him. Jonathan remained standing, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt. "I'm not here for dinner, Blackwood." "No, I suppose you're not," Blackwood said, taking a slow sip of his brandy. He gestured to a chair. "Please, let's not be uncivilized. I've heard you've been asking questions around town, stirring up old ghosts. A man must be careful what he digs up. Sometimes the past is best left buried." "Some things don't stay buried," Jonathan replied, his voice level. "Like the truth." Blackwood's smile tightened. "Truth is a matter of perspective, Mr. Holly. A matter of who is left to tell the story. Your father, for instance, was a stubborn man. He failed to see the grand vision I had for this valley. He stood in the way of progress." The casual, dismissive way he spoke of his father sent a surge of hot rage through Jonathan's veins, but he kept his composure. Progress required murdering him and my mother. For the first time, a flicker of genuine surprise crossed Blackwood's face. He let out a low chuckle. "So you've pieced it all together. Impressive. I suppose that little trinket of your mother's held more than just sentimental value." He set his glass down, his demeanor shifting from feigned civility to open threat. "It changes nothing. That land is mine legally and in every other way that matters. The original deed was destroyed in the fire. The only official record is the one that bears my name." "You're a liar," Jonathan said. "Half of that deed was in my mother's locket. And you have the other half." Blackwood's eyes gleamed with a cold, triumphant light. "Even if I did, what do you propose to do about it? You are one man. I am this valley. The law, the businesses, the guns, they all belong to me. You are a ghost, Mr. Holly. And I am about to exorcise you." He nodded subtly toward the doorway. Two of his guards stepped into the room, their rifles leveled at Jonathan's chest. Jonathan's own gun was in his hand, in a blur of motion aimed squarely at Blackwood's heart. The room was locked in a tense standoff. "You kill me. You'll never leave this house alive," Blackwood said, his voice calm. "Maybe," Jonathan replied. "But I'll take you with me, and all your money won't do you any good in hell." The standoff stretched for a long, silent minute. Blackwood studied Jonathan, a flicker of what looked like grudging respect in his cold eyes. Finally, he gave a curt nod. The guards lowered their rifles. "Get out of my house." Blackwood hissed, his mask of civility gone, revealing the venomous creature beneath. "And get out of my valley. This is your final warning. The next time we meet, one of us will be leaving redemption in a pine box." Jonathan backed out of the room, his gun still trained on Blackwood. He didn't holster it until he was on his horse and riding hard down the long driveway, the lights of the stolen mansion shrinking behind him. He hadn't found the deed, but he had found something else, the confirmation he needed. He had looked his family's killer in the eye, and he had made the man blink. The game had changed. Blackwood knew that Jonathan wouldn't be scared away. Now it was a fight to the death. The confrontation at the ranch drew the battle lines in the dust of redemption. Blackwood, having failed to intimidate Jonathan, escalated his campaign of terror. His riders became a constant, menacing presence in the town, harassing anyone who even spoke to Jonathan. The windows of Elena's saloon room were shattered one night, a clear message that association with him was dangerous. The town cowered, the streets emptying whenever Jonathan walked down them. He was an outcast, a pariah, fighting a war no one else dared to join. But he was not entirely alone. Elena, more defiant than ever after the attack, refused to abandon him. They met in secret in the dead of night, in the back room of the saloon, or in the quiet solitude of the church. She became his eyes and ears in the town, gathering whispers and rumors while he planned his next move. "He keeps all his important papers in a safe in his study," she told him one night, her voice barely a whisper in the flickering candlelight. "One of the girls who used to work at the ranch told me. It's behind a large painting of a ship in a storm." This was the chance he had been waiting for. He needed to get back into that house, into that study. But it was a suicide mission. The ranch was guarded day and night. As they plotted, the sky outside began to darken, the wind picking up with a low, mournful howl. A storm was coming, a massive sandstorm rolling in from the plains. The locals called them dusters, and they could blot out the sun for hours, turning day into a chaotic, suffocating twilight. This is it. Jonathan said, a sudden, desperate plan forming in his mind. The storm. It's our cover. As the first waves of sand and grit began to lash the town, Jonathan rode out toward the ranch. The world dissolved into a swirling vortex of brown dust. The wind screamed in his ears, and visibility dropped to near zero. It was a chaotic, disorienting nightmare, but it was also the perfect cloak. Under the cover of the raging storm, he was able to bypass the outer guards, who were hunkered down, their faces wrapped in cloth against the stinging sand. He reached the house, a dark monolith, barely visible through the tempest. He found a window at the back, shattered it with the butt of his pistol, and slipped inside. The house was eerily quiet, the howl of the storm outside muffling his every sound. He moved through the dark, opulent rooms, like a wraith, his gun drawn. He found the study just as Elena had described. A large, dramatic painting of a ship being torn apart by a stormy sea hung over the fireplace. He swung it aside. There was the safe. He was no safecracker, but years as a ranger had taught him a few things. Using a knife and a small metal file from his saddlebag, he went to work on the lock. It was a slow, painstaking process, his ears straining to hear the faint clicks of the tumblers over the roar of the wind. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked behind him. He spun around, pistol raised, but it was too late. One of Blackwood's guards stood in the doorway, his own gun leveled. Before either could fire, a voice echoed from the hallway. "Hold your fire, Daniel. I want to have a word with our guest." Silas Blackwood stepped into the room, a lantern in one hand and a cruel smile on his face. Behind him stood another guard, and he was holding a struggling Elena, her hands bound, a gag over her mouth. Jonathan's blood turned to ice. "Let her go, Blackwood. She has nothing to do with this." "On the contrary," Blackwood said smoothly. "She has everything to do with this. She is your weakness. I suspected you might try something foolish during the storm, so I took out a little insurance." He nodded to the guard holding Elena, who pressed the barrel of his gun to her temple. "Now drop your weapon, Mr. Holly, or the good Miss Elena pays the price for your trespassing." Jonathan's mind raced. He was trapped. Any move he made would get Elena killed. With a curse, he slowly lowered his Colt and let it fall to the floor. The guard kicked it away. "Excellent," Blackwood purred. "You see, every man has a price. Every man has a breaking point. Yours, it seems, is a sentimental attachment to a saloon girl." He gestured toward the safe. "Were you looking for this?" He walked to the safe, spun the dial with practiced ease, and opened it. From inside, he pulled out a folded yellow document, the other half of the deed. He held it up for Jonathan to see. "My father started with nothing." Blackwood began, his voice taking on a theatrical storytelling tone as the storm raged outside, rattling the windows. "He worked this very land as a sharecropper for your grandfather. A proud, arrogant man who treated my father like dirt. He cheated him, paid him a pittance, and finally cast him aside when he was too old to work. My family starved that winter. My younger sister died. All while your family feasted in their warm house." His voice grew harder, laced with a venom that had been brewing for decades. "Your father was just like him. He refused to sell me this land, the land my family had bled for. He called me trash. So I took it. I took it all. It wasn't just about the land, Holly. It was about retribution, a debt of blood that had to be paid." As he spoke, a movement in the doorway caught Jonathan's eye. It was Sheriff Elias, his face pale as a ghost, his shotgun held loosely in his hands. Sheriff Jonathan called out, a surge of hope rising in him. But the hope died as soon as he saw the sheriff's eyes. They weren't filled with resolve. They were filled with terror and shame. Blackwood laughed. "Ah, Sheriff Thorne joins our little party. Don't look so surprised, Holly. How do you think I knew you were so fond of Miss Elena? The sheriff has been a most reliable source of information. He understands the importance of protecting his own family." The secondary betrayal hit Jonathan like a physical blow. Elias, the weary but seemingly good man, had been Blackwood's informant all along. Elias. Why? He has my wife. My children. Elias stammered, his shotgun trembling. He said he'd kill them if I didn't. I'm sorry, Jonathan. Everyone is afraid of something, Blackwood said with a dismissive wave. He turned his attention back to Jonathan, raising his own pistol. And now this story comes to its long overdue end. But in that moment of distraction, as Blackwood gloated, Jonathan acted. He kicked over the heavy oak table between them, sending it crashing into Blackwood's legs. The pistol shot went wide, shattering a mirror on the wall. Jonathan lunged, tackling the guard who held Elena. The storm outside roared in a furious crescendo as the room erupted into chaos. Elena, freed, scrambled for cover. The second guard fired the bullet, whizzing past Jonathan's head. From the doorway, a shotgun blast echoed deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. The guard who had fired at Jonathan crumpled to the floor, a smoking hole in his chest. Sheriff Elias stood there, his face a mask of anguish and resolve, having finally chosen a side. Jonathan wrestled the pistol from the first guard and brought the butt down hard on the man's head, knocking him unconscious. Now it was just him and Blackwood. Blackwood had recovered, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. He lunged at Jonathan not with a gun, but with a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. He swung it wildly, forcing Jonathan back. The two men struggled, crashing against the furniture, their fight a desperate, brutal dance, lit by the flickering lantern light and flashes of lightning from the storm outside. Jonathan managed to disarm Blackwood, sending the poker clattering across the floor. He landed a solid punch to Blackwood's jaw, sending the older man staggering back against his desk. The deed which Blackwood had dropped lay on the floor between them. Jonathan drew his pistol and leveled it at Blackwood's chest. He had him. The man who had destroyed his family, stolen his legacy, and terrorized an entire town was at his mercy. The ghosts of his parents screamed for vengeance in his mind. One pull of the trigger, and it would all be over. Justice. Or was it just revenge? He looked at Blackwood's terrified, hate-filled face. He saw Elena watching him, her eyes wide. He saw the tormented face of Sheriff Elias. Killing Blackwood now would make him no better than the man he despised. It would be an act of rage, not law. With a deep, shuddering breath, Jonathan lowered the barrel of his gun. "No," he said, his voice raw. "You'll face the law. You'll stand trial for what you did. You'll be stripped of everything you stole. That's more justice than you ever gave my family." He picked up the two halves of the deed, fitting them together. The complete story written in faded ink. He had it all. He had won. Not by killing his enemy, but by refusing to become him. The sandstorm abated as dawn broke, leaving behind a world scoured clean and unnaturally quiet. The sky was a pale, bruised purple. Jonathan, with Elena and a guilt-ridden Sheriff Elias, escorted Silas Blackwood and his captured men back to redemption. The ride was silent, the weight of the night's events pressing down on all of them. When they reached the town, the people emerged from their homes blinking in the strange light, and their faces a mixture of fear and awe as they saw the great Silas Blackwood bound and defeated. For the first time in years, the suffocating pall of his power over them had lifted. A troop of federal marshals summoned by a telegraph Jonathan had paid a young boy to send. 2 days prior was waiting for them. He had anticipated needing the law on his side one way or another. He handed Blackwood over, along with the pieced-together deed and his sworn testimony. The marshals took the land baron into custody, his reign of terror finally at an end. Then Jonathan turned to Sheriff Elias. The older man stood with his head bowed, his shotgun hanging limply in his hand. He didn't try to run or make excuses. "I'll testify against him," Elias said, his voice thick with shame. "I'll tell them everything, about his threats, about what I did. I deserve whatever's coming to me." Jonathan looked at the broken man and felt not anger, but a tired sort of pity. "Your judgment won't come from me, Elias. It'll come from the people of this town. You have to earn back their trust if you can." He left the sheriff to face the silent, watching eyes of the townsfolk he had betrayed. In the days that followed, redemption began to breathe again. With Blackwood gone, a sense of hope, fragile but real, returned to the valley. The townsfolk who had once shunned Jonathan now looked to him with respect, seeing him not as an outcast, but as a reluctant leader. Using the restored deed, Jonathan worked with the federal authorities to untangle the legal mess Blackwood had created. The final, unexpected surprise came when the marshals confirmed the deed's original boundaries. It encompassed not only Jonathan's ranch, but the land on which the entire town of Redemption was built. Blackwood had been illegally charging the settlers for land that was never his to sell. With a single selfless act, Jonathan signed over the town plots to the families who lived there, giving them legal claim to their homes and businesses, freeing them forever. He was no longer just a man who had reclaimed his past. He had become the founder of a just and free community. His own business was not yet finished. He rode out to the far edge of his property, to a small windswept hill overlooking the valley. There, beneath a gnarled old cottonwood tree, were two unmarked, sunken patches of earth. His parents' graves lost and forgotten for 15 years. He spent the rest of an afternoon crafting two simple wooden crosses. He erected one for his father, Elias Holly, and one for his mother, Maria. Then he took out the silver locket. He opened it one last time, looking at the tiny portrait of his wife, Sarah. He had fought for this memory, had journeyed into the heart of his own darkness to reclaim it. But now he understood. He no longer needed to carry her in silver and steel. He carried her in his heart. With a gentle reverence, he draped the locket's chain over the cross he had made for his mother, a symbolic offering of one family's memory to another. He was letting go, not of the love, but of the grief, the guilt, the haunting weight of the past. He was no longer running from his ghosts. He was at peace with them, building a future on the foundation of their sacrifice. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, Elena rode up the hill and dismounted, coming to stand beside him. She stood in silence for a long moment, her presence a quiet comfort. "It's beautiful land," she said softly. Jonathan looked out at the sprawling valley, at the lights of the town beginning to twinkle in the twilight. It was his land, his home. He had come to Redemption seeking solitude and had found a community. He had come seeking to bury his past and had instead reclaimed it. He had faced down his family's murderer and, in choosing justice over revenge, had finally found the peace that had eluded him for so long. He had found his redemption. He reached out and took Elena's hand, his fingers lacing through hers. A new beginning, born from an ending, forged in blood and fire.